So welcome everyone to the Terminology Leading Practices stream of the SNOMED Expo 2023. Should I stop? Yeah. So hello again, everyone. And I'm still sorry for the slight delay. But now we're ready and we have our screen up here. And I would like to welcome you to the Terminology Leading Practices stream of the SNOMED Expo 2023. My name is Højen and I'm an implementation support specialist at SNOMED International. And together with my colleague Alejandro Lopez Osornio, I have the pleasure of welcoming us for this presentation, where we're going to dive into some of what we've already heard Ulrik talking about earlier in this stream. But we've prepared a short presentation on entitled Leveraging the Post-Coordination Guide and the Snowstorm Reference Implementation. So we're going to dive a little bit into what this guide is about and hopefully also promote some even more trial use of these principles. So welcome, Alejandro.
Thank you. So basically, post-coordination is really old. It started when SNOMED was designed in 2002. That was already part of the design. The idea that some part of the content would be pre-coordinated and released as concepts in the terminology, but there was always the space for people to combine the concepts on their own to create new meanings. There were some technological limitations, and that made that possible, but really difficult to realize in practice, yes. So the evolution of the reasoners, the terminology servers, and the standards like FHIR over the last years created an inflection point in the last year when it was really possible to create something simple that will do that. So in that context, the organization releases the practical guide that Ulrik was mentioning before, a set of transformations that it's a strategy to simplify and make more secure post-coordination. And the organization also work on a reference implementation of a terminology server that supports post-coordination. And we did that in conjunction with other providers in the languages group, like CSI or B2I, that they have their own servers that support post-coordination in some way. So the idea is this is just one example of that. And we also created a demonstrator tool that will show post-coordination working in real time. That is something that for some people, it was really difficult to see for a long time. So you want to comment something there?
Yeah, I can. So so the languages, the SNOMED International Languages Group, or Group for Computable Languages, spent a few years on discussing approaches to pre-coordination and especially approaches to safe post-coordination. So even though, as Alejandro says, it's been a known principle for ever since the beginning of SNOMED CT, actual techniques to ensure that we apply post-coordination in a safe manner has been undiscovered. So we tried to present some of the principles that and the results of the discussions that we had within the group. So the guide you'll find at snomed.org/postcoordination. So that's where you can find it. And the current content in the guide spans over the topics you see here. So an introduction where we go into the distinction between what is it we mean when we say pre-coordination versus post-coordination, what is the role of the SNOMED CT concept model and the editorial guidance when it comes to applying post-coordination, what syntax do you use to represent post-coordinated expressions, and what are the various forms that are important to acknowledge and to respect when you work with post-coordination, benefits and challenges, and use cases. We also talk about alternatives, because I think when you start to decide to go down the route of using post-coordination, it's very important to have made that analysis of what are our alternatives. Could we use an information model instead to decompose the meanings, or what other strategies should we create an extension and really have pre-coordinated concepts? There are alternatives, and it should be part of that analysis. We have a chapter on expressions in the EHR. So what does post-coordination look like in an EHR? Very different from those compositional strings that we have, composed strings that we have seen throughout the last few sessions. So how is it that you create, enter, store, display, and query, and exchange expressions? So a chapter on that. And then the final chapter is really where all the technical considerations lie. So how do you create a terminology repository or an expression repository? How do you make sure that the expressions that you create, they can be classified, transformed, classified, and then also queried? And that's where in the last chapter, we focus on all the different terminology services that are required. And there are topics that are out of scope in this first version, but we are planning for an updated version of this with the new enhancements.
Post-coordination has the same risk as authoring. You know, we have the authoring course with certification level 1, level 2. Authoring is really complex, and those courses are excellent, are really interesting, but they require a lot of dedication because there are some risks. It's so expressive, SNOMED, that you can create the same meaning in different ways. You can try to represent the same, but it's not actually logically the same, even when you try to represent the same. So what coordination has that limitation. If you have complete freedom to create any expression to represent the meaning, you have the risk of actually not saying what you mean, and or maybe not saying in the right way, so it's identical or equivalent to what's already in the SNOMED. So that's how we reach to the idea of creating these different levels of post-coordination, where level 0 is the raw post-coordination, in which you have all the responsibility to create a perfect expression. Yes, and the server is really agnostic on that sense. It will take whatever you have and it will use it to classify and compare with the rest of the terminology. But then we thought of adding layers of help to the author, so you can provide a simplified expression, and that expression is transformed into something that is more aligned with all the editorial guidelines, and it's just modeled in the same way the rest of the SNOMED model is created. Basically, we are working on these first two levels, level 1 and level 2. And level 1 is a level in which we identify common use cases in the SNOMED languages group that were recurrent and were very used in the practical implementations. And we identify these scenarios, for example. If you refine an existing attribute, if you add a self-group attribute, if you add severity to a clinical finding, if you add lateralization, if you do a clinical finding or a procedure, or if you add context to clinical findings or procedures. These are practical use cases that will allow you to submit a very simple expression that maybe sometimes is even invalid, like pain of the ear, laterality left. Laterality is an attribute that is applied to body structures. But in a simplified way, you can apply the laterality to the finding, and the server will rearrange the laterality to put it in the right place, attached to the body structure actually.
No, I could comment that there are, of course, a lot of other post-coordinations that could be done. But this is really the set where those discussions about, can we really be sure that once we have transformed this, that it still means what the close to, this is what you would call a close to user form when you apply a laterality to a finding that goes beyond the concept model. So these common post-coordinations that you would do, we need to ensure that when we transform them, they still mean what was the intended meaning. So that's why you don't see all post-coordinations complete that are possible at this level of the guide.
Exactly. You can use level 0 and have the full power of post-coordination. They don't get the demo, they don't listen to us either.
So if anyone in the room here has any questions, please go to the microphone and we can have a small talk.
Thank you. Good presentation, even though the technicians standing by your side there. I know that you should never show this post-coordination directly to end user. I know all of that. I personally would say you should never show the browser to an end user because it's confusing. It's for development. But still, have you put the browser on top of the post-coordination repository? Have you tried to do that? Because we would be interested in just seeing, because what I find difficult just working with the Fireway guys is seeing that it actually infers the coherence.
Yeah.
I can query up and down, I can do everything, but it's sort of a black box. So I was just wondering, have you ever tried it?
No, we never tried it, but it's not difficult. I think it's something that Guy will be happy to play around with. It's a good idea. It's a good idea.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. To be able to visualize it, and because there is also the one of the things that we would have liked to show you is how when you create an expression, Snowstorm will also suggest if there is a pre-coordinated concept already available that has the same properties as you have just formulated in your expression, giving the implementer the opportunity to decide, will we go down the pure post-coordination route here, or will we actually use a pre-coordinated concept? And that is something that would be very clear in a browser view, that there would be an overlap or a duplicate, that you have created duplicate. So it's definitely something. He must have a spare 5 minutes in a coffee break where he can try that out.
And we are doing it in simplex now.
Yeah.
So it should be,
Yeah. So it's
very good idea.
Very good idea. We will take that forward. Thank you. Other questions?
I think we have one more.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, so I actually got a follow-up question. The question on my tablet is very similar. So the colleague before me said that post-coordination and/or SNOMED shouldn't really be directly exposed to clinician users. Do you think that with appropriate user interfaces, this is actually accomplishable for post-coordination? Because when users have to understand the machine-readable concept model, basically the modeling behind SNOMED to define the post-coordinated expressions that they need, that will bring them toward basically having to learn about SNOMED, which is probably very challenging for for clinicians.
One of the principles we have is that clinicians don't need to actually know SNOMED. The UI should be so intuitive that when you want to do research, maybe you start to learn about SNOMED because you need to learn all the power. But as a clinician, recording data should not be necessary. And one of the demos you will find is something that if you search a finding, for example, it will suggest a few things that you can post-coordinate, like severity. And if you search a finding that has a lateralizable organ, like a bone or a lung or something like that, you will get also a laterality option to post-coordinate in a very intuitive way that appears and disappears according to the context.
But what I'm getting from that is that you would say that it's very use case driven, because you need user interfaces for every use case where you want to post-coordinate. Well, I can imagine that it's easy enough to hide pre-coordinated expressions from users, but post-coordinated, I think that's much more complicated.
Exactly. The users interact with the text, and the text is linked to a pre-coordinated expression. So they use natural language to search and find things, and that's completely perfect, usable, and that's SNOMED, the typical SNOMED. For post-coordination, you need to design a UI. You're right. It's use case driven, like you say, but there are some generic use cases like severities, lateralities that are really wide.
All right, thank you.
No, there should be the boring inventor guide. I think at least my rule of thumb is if I start to consider to have to really show how post-coordinated expression looks like from end user, I probably should not do post-coordination. Probably should do it with my intellectual model instead, because that's usually much easier to get the clinician that are used to documents to understand.
Yeah, I completely follow that, and that is an approach, especially if you have user interfaces where you have very structured data input. But the fact is that many implementers don't have that. They have maybe an information model where they use a single field or a few fields to capture information that you would, with the post-coordination, have several fields for. So using post-coordination, or the reason why post-coordination is a requirement very often is that you have that need to be able to capture a lot of context or information in a single expression. So for the case where for a clinician should never see the post-coordinated expression, they should see the clinical terms, and they should see clinical terms that are meaningful to them. What goes on behind the scenes, whether it's decomposed into separate fields in the information model, or whether you have a post-coordinated SNOMED expression that goes into a single field, that shouldn't matter to the clinician. The point should be that what the term that the clinician sees represents the meaning that is also stored, whether it being a post-coordinated expression or a single concept identifier. So post-coordination is bound to be connected to the information model, as is use of pre-coordinated concepts. Yeah. So you need to make a decision on that.
Yeah. And for analytics also, you can convert the information model to an expression for analysis purposes, but not for showing it. Yeah. So we have a question from Debbie in the chat. It says, if you post-coordinate a concept and it's later released as a pre-coordinated concept, should you replace the post-coordinated concept with a new one, or is it valid? Well, that's a good question, but we think they should not. They should leave it there. Even you can create today a post-coordinated expression that is equivalent to a pre-coordinated concept, because sometimes your search didn't show the other one, and you just added a modifier that makes it equivalent. And we consider it fine to have equivalence in that sense.
And Debbie, I think it's a matter of it's a decision. We can't say whether you should do one or the other, because it depends on why you are doing the post-coordination. If it's because you want like a consistent approach to all the different various types of some clinical information you're trying to capture, then you may want to keep it. But if you really want to be using pre-coordination and avoid all the things that may go ahead with maintenance of post-coordinated expressions, then I would go with the pre-coordinated concept. So it's really a decision you would need to make internally in your implementation team. So we are almost at the end of time for this stream. Do anyone have the final question? No. Well, thank you very much for bearing with us with these technical issues, and it's time for a break now. So go into the lobby. For those of you online, you can have a coffee at home, and the rest of us will go out there in the lobby here at the hotel, and we can talk a bit more about post-coordination there. So enjoy the rest of the expo.